The sound of a rifle shot echoed across the dusty main street of Llano, Texas, as Vaughn Sutton lowered his weapon and watched the wanted poster flutter to the ground, a neat hole punched through the center. It was 1875, and Vaughn had just collected another bounty. His reputation as the most stone-faced, untrusting gunslinger in the territory growing with each outlaw he brought in, dead or alive. What folks didn't know was that behind those cold gray eyes lay a graveyard of betrayals that had taught him one unfailing lesson. In the Wild West, a smile was just the prelude to a knife in your back. "Nice shot, Sutton," Sheriff Miller called from the jailhouse porch, counting out the bounty money. Though I'd have preferred him breathing. Vaughn holstered his revolver, his face impassive as granite. "Dead men don't lie, Sheriff." And this one had a habit of doing just that. The sheriff handed over the stack of bills. "That's the third one this month. You ever think about settling down? Man can't live on vengeance forever." Vaughn pocketed the money without counting it. "Not vengeance. Justice." He turned away, heading toward the saloon, his spurs clinking against the hard-packed dirt. Justice was all he had left after what happened in Abilene 4 years back, the memory of a smiling woman who'd stolen more than his money and left him for dead beside a dried-up creek. The Broken Spoke Saloon was doing brisk business despite the early hour. Vaughn pushed through the swinging doors, ignoring the momentary hush that fell over the room. His reputation had a way of silencing idle chatter. He took his usual spot at the far end of the bar where he could see both the entrance and the stairs leading to the rooms above. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender, who nodded and poured without a word. Vaughn had just raised the glass to his lips when the saloon doors swung open again, and a woman stepped through, not one of the painted ladies who worked the place, but someone new. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun, and she carried herself with a dignity that seemed out of place in the smoke-filled room. Their eyes met across the crowded saloon, and she did something that caught him entirely off guard. She smiled. Not the practiced smile of a woman looking for something, not the false smile that masked deceit, but something genuine that reached her eyes and revealed a small dimple in her right cheek. Vaughn looked away first, draining his whiskey and signaling for another. Women with smiles like that were the most dangerous kind of all. "Excuse me." Her voice came from beside him suddenly. "I'm looking for work. They said the owner might be here." Vaughn didn't turn his head. "Try the back office." "Thank you," she replied, and he made the mistake of looking at her again. Those eyes, clear blue like a summer sky, held no guile, no hidden agenda that he could detect. Her smile returned, smaller this time, but still genuine. "I'm Beatrice Edwards, by the way. New in town." "Didn't ask," Vaughn replied, returning to his whiskey. If his curtness offended her, she didn't show it. Instead, she nodded and made her way toward the back of the saloon, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and something else, hope, perhaps. Whatever it was, Vaughn didn't care for how it unsettled him. He finished his drink quickly and left, eager to escape the confines of the saloon and the strange feeling the woman had stirred within him. Outside, the Texas sun beat down mercilessly, but Vaughn welcomed the heat. It cleared his head and reminded him of the harsh realities of the world he inhabited, a world where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He headed toward the livery to check on his horse, a dappled gray stallion named Ghost. The animal was one of the few living things Vaughn allowed himself to care about. As he approached the stables, he heard a commotion, angry voices, then the sound of something breaking. "You ain't welcome here no more, Crenshaw," came the livery owner's voice. "I told you last time, pay your debts or take your business elsewhere." Vaughn quickened his pace, hand instinctively dropping to his revolver. He rounded the corner to find Tucker Crenshaw, a local cattle baron's son known for his hot temper and sense of entitlement, shoving the elderly stable owner against a post. "My father owns half this miserable town," Crenshaw was saying, his words slurred with drink despite the early hour. "You'll saddle my horse when I tell you to, old man, or you'll what?" Vaughn's voice cut through the air like a whip. Crenshaw turned, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. Recognition dawned in his bloodshot eyes, followed quickly by fear. "Sutton, this ain't your business." "Making it my business," Vaughn replied, his hand still resting on his revolver. "Let him go." For a moment, It seemed Crenshaw might be drunk enough to try something foolish. Then sense prevailed, and he released the stable owner with a shove. Always playing the hero, ain't you, Sutton? One of these days, that gun won't be enough. Today isn't that day, Vaughn said evenly. Walk away. Crenshaw spat on the ground between them, but backed off, stumbling slightly as he headed toward the saloon. This ain't over, he called over his shoulder. The livery owner, Mr. Perkins, straightened his vest with shaking hands. Much obliged, Mr. Sutton. That boy's been nothing but trouble since he came back from schooling back east. Vaughn nodded. Ghost all right. Right as rain. Fed him extra oats this morning, figured he earned it. Carrying you all the way to Fort Worth and back this week. Vaughn handed the man a few coins. Keep him saddled. Might need to leave in a hurry. He always did. 4 years of drifting had taught him to travel light and be ready to move at a moment's notice. Ties to people, to places they were chains that would only weigh a man down in the end. As Vaughn walked back toward the boarding house where he kept a room, he spotted the woman from the saloon, Beatrice, emerging from the general store with a small paper package. She was smiling again, thanking the shopkeeper with a warmth that seemed genuine. Vaughn found himself slowing his pace, watching her longer than he should have. When she turned and saw him, her smile brightened. Instead of looking away, she actually walked toward him, that same directness in her eyes that had caught him off guard earlier. We meet again, she said. I got the job at the saloon. Not serving drinks, she added quickly, seeing his expression. Bookkeeping. The owner says his accounts are a mess. Vaughn nodded, unsure why she was telling him this or why he was still standing there listening. I wanted to thank you properly for your help earlier, she continued. I've only been in Llano 3 days, and you're the first person who's been remotely helpful without wanting something in return. Didn't do much, Vaughn replied, shifting uncomfortably under her direct gaze. More than most. Her smile softened. You have a name, sir, or should I just call you the brooding gentleman with the fast gun? The corner of Vaughn's mouth twitched involuntarily. Vaughn Sutton, the bounty hunter? Her eyes widened slightly, but interestingly, there was no fear in them, only curiosity. They were talking about you in the general store. Said you brought in the Calloway brothers last week. Just the job, he said, already regretting the conversation. He tipped his hat and made to move past her. Good day, Miss Edwards. Mr. Sutton, she called after him, causing him to pause. If you don't mind my asking, why bounty hunting? He turned back, studying her for a moment. Most folks didn't dare ask him personal questions. Simple, he finally said. In my line of work, people show their true faces. No pretending to be something they're not. She considered this, her head tilting slightly. That sounds rather lonely. Better lonely than fooled, he replied, and this time he did walk away, ignoring the strange twist in his gut as he felt her eyes following him down the street. Over the next few days, Vaughn found himself encountering Beatrice Edwards with unsettling frequency. Llano wasn't a large town, but it was big enough that he shouldn't have crossed paths with her as often as he did. Yet there she was at the general store when he went to buy ammunition, walking past the telegraph office as he collected information on a new bounty, even sitting in the church pew across from him on Sunday, a rare appearance he made only to maintain certain connections with the law-abiding citizens of the town. And each time, she smiled at him, that same genuine smile that seemed to suggest she was genuinely pleased to see him. It was disconcerting. On the 4th day, he entered the Broken Spoke for his evening whiskey to find her behind the bar, sleeves rolled up, a ledger open before her. Evening, Mr. Sutton, she greeted him, that dimple appearing in her right cheek. Mr. Holloway is in the back room playing cards. I'm watching the bar for an hour. Vaughn nodded and took his usual spot. After a moment, she placed a glass of whiskey before him without being asked. Noticed your preference, she explained when he raised an eyebrow. He took a sip, finding it was exactly what he would have ordered. You're observant. A necessary skill when you grow up with 5 younger siblings, she replied, returning to her ledger but continuing to speak. Everyone needed something different, and my parents were too busy with the farm to keep track. Despite himself, Vaughn found himself asking, where's your family now? Something flickered in her eyes, a shadow of grief quickly masked. Gone. Farm failed after the drought of '71. Fever took my parents and the little ones the following winter. My brother joined the army, and my sister married a shopkeeper in Austin. She smiled again, but this time it didn't quite reach her eyes. So here I am, starting over. Vaughn recognized the look of someone who had lost everything but refused to be broken by it. It was a look he saw in the mirror every morning. "Why Llano?" he asked, surprising himself with his continued interest. She shrugged slightly. "Heard it was growing. Needed somewhere not too big, not too small. Somewhere I could make a fresh start without anyone knowing my business." She glanced up at him. "I imagine you understand something about that, Mr. Sutton." He did, more than she knew. But he wasn't about to admit it. Instead, he finished his whiskey and stood to leave. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, and there was something in her voice, not flirtation, not desperation, just simple human connection. "Maybe," he replied, and left before she could say anything more. That night, Vaughn lay awake in his Spartan room at the boarding house, thinking about Beatrice Edwards and her persistent smile. He didn't trust it, couldn't trust it, and yet he found himself unable to detect any falsehood behind it. Perhaps she was simply better at deception than most, or perhaps no. He shut down that line of thinking immediately. For years ago, he'd made the mistake of believing in someone's smile, in their sweet words and softer touches. He still carried the scar on his side, where Isabel's knife had slipped between his ribs while he slept beside her, trusting and foolish. She'd taken everything, his money, his horse, even his father's pocket watch, and left him to die. The only reason he hadn't was pure stubbornness and the luck of a passing trapper who'd found him half dead. Never again, he'd promised himself. And he'd kept that promise through countless towns, bounties, and women who'd tried to get close to the infamous bounty hunter with the cold eyes and fast gun. Yet here he was, lying awake thinking about a bookkeeper with honey blonde hair and a smile that seemed to promise something he'd long since stopped believing in. The next day brought news of a sizable bounty on a man named Fletcher Davis, wanted for a string of stagecoach robberies between San Antonio and Austin. The reward was enough to keep Vaughn comfortable for months, and more importantly, it was a reason to leave Llano and its unsettling new bookkeeper behind. He was at the livery, saddling Ghost for the journey, when he heard quick footsteps approaching. "You're leaving?" Beatrice's voice carried a note of disappointment that caught him off guard. Vaughn tightened Ghost's cinch before turning to face her. "Got work." "I see." She stood there, a small package in her hands, looking uncertain for the first time since he'd met her. "I thought. Well, it doesn't matter. I brought you something for the journey." She held out the package. "Just some bread and dried beef. The trail rations from the general store are barely edible." Vaughn stared at the package, then at her, suspicion warring with something else. "Why? Why what? Why do this? You barely know me." Her smile returned, softer now. "Because everyone deserves a kindness now and then, Mr. Sutton. Even brooding bounty hunters." He hesitated before taking the package, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Thank you," he said stiffly, and used to the words. "How long will you be gone?" she asked as he secured the package in his saddlebag. "Hard to say. Week, maybe more." She nodded, taking a step back. "Well, safe travels, Mr. Sutton. I hope you find what you're looking for." As he mounted Ghost and rode out of town, Vaughn told himself the strange tightness in his chest was just anticipation of the hunt ahead. It had nothing to do with the way she'd looked at him, or the unexpected kindness of her gesture, or the fact that for the first time in 4 years, someone seemed genuinely sorry to see him leave. The trail led Vaughn south toward the hill country, following rumors and whispers of Fletcher Davis's last known whereabouts. 3 days in, he stopped at a small trading post to water Ghost and pick up supplies. The afternoon was waning, the golden Texas light slanting across the plains, when he spotted dust on the horizon. Riders, moving fast. His instincts, honed by years of surviving in a land where hesitation meant death, sent him into the scrub brush beside the trading post. Ghost followed obediently, trained to move silently when needed. For riders approached, their horses lathered and breathing hard. They dismounted roughly, and Vaughn recognized the leader immediately from the wanted poster. Fletcher Davis, a tall man with a prominent scar crossing his left cheek. The others were clearly part of his gang, all armed and looking nervously over their shoulders. "Water and supplies," Davis ordered the trading post owner, an elderly man who emerged with hands raised. "And be quick about it." Vaughn weighed his options. 4 against 1 weren't great odds, even for him. He could wait until they left, follow them to their camp, and take Davis when the others were sleeping. It was the sensible approach, the one that had kept him alive all these years. But then Davis did something that changed the calculation entirely. He pulled out his revolver and shot the trading post owner point blank, the old man's body crumpling to the dusty ground. "No witnesses," Davis said coldly to his shocked companions. "Now get what we need and burn the rest. Make it look like Indians." Cold fury replaced caution in Vaughn's veins. He'd seen too many innocent people die at the hands of men like Davis, men who killed for convenience, who thought their desires outweighed others' lives. Drawing his rifle, he took careful aim at the closest gang member. The first shot caught the man in the chest, dropping him instantly. The second found another as he turned, gun half drawn. Davis and the remaining man dove for cover as Vaughn shifted position, moving quickly through the brush. "It's Sutton," he heard Davis shout. "The damn bounty hunter." A volley of gunfire tore through the brush where Vaughn had been moments before. He circled behind an overturned wagon, heart pounding but hands steady. This was what he knew, what he was good at, the clarity of combat, where motives were transparent and survival depended on skill, not trust. The third man made the mistake of breaking cover too soon. Vaughn's shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. His second shot was more definitive. Now it was just Davis, cornered and desperate. "Sutton," the outlaw called. "Let's talk this through. There's money more than that bounty. We can split it." Vaughn didn't respond, moving silently toward the voice. "I've got connections. People who can make you rich," Davis continued, panic edging into his voice. "Come on, man. Everyone's got a price." Vaughn rounded the corner of the trading post to find Davis aiming at the door, expecting him to come from that direction. The outlaw never saw the shot that ended him. As the echo of the final gunshot faded across the plains, Vaughn stood among the bodies, feeling the familiar emptiness that always followed a hunt. No satisfaction, no remorse, just the hollow knowledge of a job completed. He buried the trading post owner properly, marking the grave with a wooden cross, before securing Davis's body across one of the gang's horses. The bounty specified dead or alive, and dead was considerably easier to transport. That night, camped beside a small creek, Vaughn unwrapped the package Beatrice had given him. The bread was fresh and still soft, the dried beef seasoned with pepper and herbs that made it far better than the usual trail fare. At the bottom of the package, he found something unexpected, a small piece of paper with flowing script. "Even the loneliest path can lead to friendship. Safe travels. B." Vaughn stared at the note for a long time before carefully folding it and tucking it into his shirt pocket. Then he leaned back against his saddle and looked up at the star-filled Texas sky, wondering what Beatrice Edwards would think if she could see him now, surrounded by death, as alone as a man could be. For the first time in years, the solitude felt less like a choice and more like a burden. The journey back to Llano took longer than expected. A flash flood washed out the main trail, forcing Vaughn to take a circuitous route. By the time he arrived, it had been nearly 2 weeks since he'd left, and the body of Fletcher Davis, preserved with frontier techniques, was beginning to show the effects of the delay. Sheriff Miller wrinkled his nose as Vaughn delivered his bounty. "Cutting it close, Sutton. Another day, and I'd have had to refuse delivery." "Had complications," Vaughn replied shortly, watching as the sheriff counted out the reward money. "Well, you earned this one." Davis had a lot of friends in low places. Word is they're mighty upset about his demise. The sheriff handed over the money. "Might want to keep your head down for a while." Vaughn nodded, pocketing the money. "Any trouble in town while I was gone?" "Nothing unusual." Crenshaw got himself thrown out of the Broken Spoke again. "Seems that new bookkeeper won't put up with his nonsense. Stood up to him right in front of everyone when he got handsy with one of the girls. Got a backbone of steel, that one." Something cold settled in Vaughn's stomach. "Crenshaw threatened her? You know how he is all talk." His daddy smoothed it over, as usual. The sheriff eyed Vaughn curiously. "Since when do you care about saloon gossip, Sutton?" Vaughn didn't answer, already heading for the door. The sheriff's voice followed him out. "Might want to clean up before you see her. You smell worse than your cargo." The suggestion, irritating as it was, had merit. Vaughn stopped at the boarding house long enough to bathe and change clothes before making his way to the Broken Spoke. He told himself he was just going for his usual whiskey, that checking on Beatrice Edwards was an afterthought, a minor curiosity at most. The saloon was busy, the evening crowd in full swing. Vaughn scanned the room, noting the usual faces: the card players in the corner, the ranch hands spending their wages, the painted ladies circulating among the customers. No sign of Beatrice. He made his way to the bar where Holloway, the owner, was serving drinks. "Evening, Sutton. Heard you brought in Fletcher Davis. Bad business, that one." Vaughn nodded. "Whiskey." Holloway poured the drink, sliding it across the polished wood. "If you're looking for Miss Edwards, she's not here tonight. Gave her the evening off, been working herself to the bone getting my account straight." Vaughn sipped his whiskey, deliberately casual. "Not looking for anyone." Holloway's knowing smile suggested he believed otherwise. "Well, if you weren't looking, she's staying at the Widow Kavanaugh's boarding house on Pine Street. Been taking her meals at the cafe next door most evenings." Vaughn finished his drink in silence, left money on the bar, and walked out without another word. He told himself he wasn't going to Pine Street, that he was heading back to his own boarding house to get some much-needed rest after the long journey. Yet somehow, his boots carried him toward the widow's place, a well-kept house with a small garden in front. As he approached, he spotted Beatrice sitting on the porch, a book open in her lap. The evening light caught in her honey-blonde hair, giving it a golden glow. She looked up as his footsteps sounded on the walkway, and her face transformed with that smile, the one that reached her eyes and revealed the dimple in her right cheek. It hit him like a physical force, stopping him in his tracks. "Mr. Sutton," she said, closing her book. "You're back." He nodded, suddenly at a loss for words. She stood, smoothing her skirt. "I was beginning to think you might not return. Job took longer than expected," he said, finding his voice. "Was it successful?" she asked, and he appreciated that she didn't ask for details, didn't seek the gruesome specifics that others often did. "Yes." She smiled again. "I'm glad." "Not about." "Well, I'm just glad you're back safely." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Vaughn remembered the reason he'd told himself he was coming here. "Heard there was trouble with Crenshaw." Her expression clouded slightly. "Nothing I couldn't handle." He was being inappropriate with one of the serving girls, barely more than a child. Someone needed to step in. "Could have gotten yourself hurt." Her chin lifted slightly. "Some things are worth the risk, Mr. Sutton. That girl has no one to stand up for her." Vaughn studied her, trying to reconcile this woman so principled, so unafraid with his experience of the world. People didn't put themselves at risk for strangers. They didn't stand up to men like Crenshaw without wanting something in return. They didn't smile at hard-eyed bounty hunters with genuine pleasure. Yet here she was, doing all those things. "Thank you for the provisions," he said finally. "They were appreciated." Her smile returned. "You're welcome." "I'm glad they helped." She hesitated, then added, "I don't suppose you'd care to join me for dinner? The cafe next door makes an excellent beef stew on Tuesdays." Vaughn should have declined. Every instinct built over 4 years of solitude and suspicion told him to walk away, to retreat to the safety of isolation. But as he looked at her, this woman who smiled without artifice and stood up for those who couldn't defend themselves, he found himself nodding. "I could eat," he said simply. The cafe was small and homely, with checkered tablecloths and a motherly proprietress who greeted Beatrice by name. They were shown to a corner table, somewhat removed from the other diners. "Mrs. Finch reserves this table for me," Beatrice explained as they sat. "Says I bring a book too often to be seated near chatty folks." Vaughn found himself almost smiling at that. "You read a lot." "Books were my escape growing up. The farm was isolating. Books took me places I'd never seen." She looked at him curiously. "What about you? What did you do before?" She gestured vaguely. "Before I started killing men for money," he finished bluntly. To her credit, she didn't flinch. "I was going to say before bounty hunting, but yes." Vaughn had never discussed his past with anyone in Llano. Yet something about her direct gaze made him answer honestly. "Ranching. Had a small spread near Abilene with my father. After he died, I tried to keep it going alone." "What happened?" she asked softly. He looked away, the old anger stirring. "Made a mistake. Trusted the wrong person. Lost everything." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "That's why you don't trust smiles." His gaze snapped back to hers, surprised by her perception. She continued, "I noticed, you know. The way you look at people like you're waiting for them to show their true colors. Like every kindness hides a knife. Before he could respond, Mrs. Finch arrived with 2 bowls of fragrant stew and a basket of fresh bread. They ate in silence for a few minutes, Vaughn acutely aware of Beatrice's presence across from him, of the gentle way she broke her bread, of the thoughtful expression in her eyes. "My father was the same way," she said eventually, breaking the silence. "After the bank took our first farm when I was a child, he never trusted a soul after that, especially not men in suits with friendly smiles." "Wise man," Vaughn commented. "Perhaps, but it was also a prison of his own making." She looked at him directly. "He died bitter and alone, Mr. Sutton, for all that my mother and we children were beside him. He'd locked himself away where no one could reach him." The parallel was too pointed to ignore. "Some prisons keep you safe," he said quietly, "and some just keep you lonely." Her voice was gentle, not accusatory. "I decided after I lost my family that I wouldn't live that way, that I would trust until given reason not to, that I would smile and mean it, even when life gives little reason to. And if that trust gets you killed," he asked, "then at least I'll have lived fully first." She smiled again, that same genuine expression that had first caught him off guard. "Not everyone is out to hurt you, Mr. Sutton." "Vaughn," he said suddenly, "if we're having dinner together, might as well use my name." Her smile deepened, the dimple more pronounced. "Vaughn," she repeated, and somehow his name sounded different on her lips, less a label for a killer of men, more the name of a person worth knowing. "And I'm Beatrice, though most people call me B." "Beatrice suits you better," he found himself saying. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "My mother thought so too." She said diminutives were for people with diminished personalities. For the first time in years, Vaughn felt the corner of his mouth lift in what might almost be called a smile. "Smart woman." They finished their meal with lighter conversation. Beatrice told him about the mess she'd found in the saloon's books, about her plans to stay in Llano, and perhaps eventually open a small shop of her own. Vaughn found himself listening intently, drawn in by her animated expressions and clear intelligence. When they stepped outside, the night had fully descended, stars glittering overhead in the vast Texas sky. Vaughn walked her back to the boarding house, aware of the curious glances from passers-by. The infamous bounty hunter escorting the new bookkeeper was bound to set tongues wagging. At her door, Beatrice turned to him, her expression open and warm in the lamplight. "Thank you for dinner, Vaughn. It was nice not to eat alone for a change." He nodded, suddenly awkward. "I should go, of course." She hesitated, then added, "I'm usually at the cafe around the same time most evenings, if you ever want company again." Vaughn knew he should decline, should retreat to the safety of his solitude. Instead, he heard himself say, "Maybe I will." Her smile, that same genuine, warm expression that had first caught his attention, appeared one last time before she slipped inside, leaving Vaughn standing in the darkness, wondering what in God's name he was doing. Over the next 2 weeks, Vaughn found himself returning to the cafe more evenings than not. At first, he told himself it was just for the food, which was admittedly better than what he usually ate. Then he claimed it was a convenient location to keep an eye on the town, to hear gossip that might lead to his next bounty. But the truth, which he was increasingly unable to deny, was that he enjoyed Beatrice's company. She was intelligent, well-read despite her humble background, and possessed a quiet strength that he found himself respecting more each day. She never pressed him for the bloody details of his work, never seemed repulsed by what he did, and never not once showed any sign of the falsehood he kept expecting to discover. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Vaughn found the iron walls around him beginning to crack. He started telling her things, small pieces of his past at first. About growing up on the ranch with his father after his mother died of fever. About breaking his first horse at 12. About the dreams he'd had before everything went wrong. In return, she shared her own stories about teaching her siblings to read by candlelight, about the wildflower garden she'd maintained behind the family barn, about the books she'd loved and the places she'd dreamed of seeing. "I always wanted to see the ocean," she told him one evening as they walked back from the cafe. "To stand at the edge of the continent and look out at all that endless water." "It's something," Vaughn admitted. "Saw the Gulf once, delivering cattle to Galveston. Makes a man feel small. In a good way, I think," she mused. Sometimes we need reminding that our troubles aren't as large as they seem. He glanced at her profile, softened in the evening light. Your troubles seemed pretty substantial. She nodded, acknowledging the loss they'd both experienced. They are. But they're not all of me, just as yours aren't all of you. She looked up at him with those clear blue eyes. There's more to Vaughn Sutton than what Isabel took from him. He stopped walking, startled. How did you know her name? Beatrice's expression turned apologetic. You said it once, when you were telling me about the ranch. I didn't want to interrupt. He hadn't realized he'd spoken the name aloud. It had been so long since he'd said it to anyone. I thought she was. He trailed off, unable to finish. The love of your life, Beatrice suggested gently. A mistake, he said flatly. One I don't intend to repeat. They had reached her boarding house. Instead of saying good night as usual, Beatrice turned to face him fully, her expression earnest. Vaughn, not every woman is Isabel. Not every smile hides a knife. Easy to say, he replied, the old bitterness rising. Harder to believe when you've felt the blade. I know. She reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement, and touched his arm lightly. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact between them, and Vaughn found himself frozen, not pulling away as he should have. But at some point, you have to decide if the possibility of pain is worse than the certainty of emptiness. Her words struck too close to thoughts he'd been having himself lately, uncomfortable recognitions about the hollowness of his existence before she'd smiled at him in the saloon. Before he could respond, the boarding house door opened, and the widow Kavanaugh appeared. Miss Edwards, Mr. Sutton, she greeted them, her expression carefully neutral though her eyes were shrewd. A fine evening, isn't it? Indeed it is, Mrs. Kavanaugh, Beatrice replied, withdrawing her hand from Vaughn's arm. I was just coming in. The older woman nodded. Best you do. Town's starting to talk, you know. Vaughn stiffened, but Beatrice merely smiled. People will always talk, Mrs. Kavanaugh. It's the one truly renewable resource in any town. Despite the tension of the moment, Vaughn felt that strange twitch at the corner of his mouth, again the ghost of a smile he'd thought long dead. Good night, Vaughn, Beatrice said, turning back to him. Think about what I said. As she disappeared inside, the widow gave Vaughn an appraising look. She's a good woman, Mr. Sutton. Better than most who pass through Llano. I know, he replied, surprising himself with the admission. Then you should also know that Tucker Crenshaw has been asking about her. Seems he doesn't take kindly to being humiliated by a woman. The widow's expression was grim. That boy's got a mean streak wider than the Rio Grande, and his daddy's money to back it up. A cold weight settled in Vaughn's stomach. He threatened her? Not in so many words. But he's been watching her. Following her sometimes. The widow lowered her voice. I'm only telling you this because I've seen how you look at her, Mr. Sutton. Like a man who's found water after crossing a desert. And because I think you're the kind of man who can do something about Crenshaw if need be. Vaughn nodded, his expression hardening. I appreciate the warning. See that you heed it. The widow replied, and closed the door. Vaughn stood for a long moment, looking up at the window he knew to be Beatrice's. A lamp glowed behind the curtains, and he could see her shadow moving about the room. Something protective and fierce awoke in him, something he hadn't felt in 4 long years. The feeling disturbed him enough that he sought refuge in the familiar confines of the saloon, ordering a whiskey and taking it to his usual corner. The broken spoke was busy, the piano player pounding out a lively tune while cowboys and townsmen alike drank and gambled and sought the company of the saloon girls. Vaughn was on his second whiskey when Tucker Crenshaw entered with 2 of his father's ranch hands in tow. The young man was clearly already drunk, his face flushed and his movements unsteady. He spotted Vaughn and sneered, leaning to whisper something to his companions that made them laugh uneasily. Vaughn ignored them, focusing on his drink. He had no quarrel with Crenshaw yet, despite the widow's warning, but he made note of where the men positioned themselves at the bar, keeping them in his peripheral vision. It wasn't long before Crenshaw made his way over, whiskey sloshing in his glass. Well, if it ain't the famous bounty hunter, he slurred. Heard you've been keeping company with the pretty bookkeeper. Vaughn didn't respond, which seemed to irritate Crenshaw further. What's the matter, Sutton? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just not used to a woman who ain't paid for her company? The saloon had quieted somewhat, patrons sensing the tension and turning to watch. Vaughn remained still, but his hand moved slightly closer to his revolver. I asked her, you know, Crenshaw continued, his voice carrying in the hushed room. Asked her what a fine-looking woman like her was doing with a killer like you. Know what she said? He leaned in closer, his breath sour with whiskey. Said she saw something in you worth knowing. Can you believe that? A man who shoots people for money, and she thinks there's something worth knowing. Vaughn looked up then, his gray eyes cold. Walk away, Crenshaw. The young man's face contorted with drunken anger. Or what? You'll shoot me? In front of all these witnesses? Even you ain't that cold-blooded, Sutton. Don't need to shoot you, Vaughn replied evenly. Just need to wait. Man like you. The grave will find you soon enough without my help. Crenshaw's hand moved toward his hip, where an expensive revolver was holstered. Maybe I should give the bookkeeper something to think about. Show her what happens to women who choose the wrong man in this town. In one fluid motion, Vaughn was on his feet, his revolver pressed against Crenshaw's throat before the younger man could clear his weapon. The saloon went dead silent. Threaten her again, Vaughn said, his voice so quiet only Crenshaw could hear. And they'll be searching for pieces of you from here to the Red River. He pressed the barrel harder against the soft flesh of Crenshaw's throat. Understand. Fear sobered Crenshaw instantly. He swallowed hard and nodded as much as the gun would allow. Good. Vaughn holstered his weapon and stepped back. Now get out. Crenshaw stumbled away, his companions rushing to help him out the door. The saloon remained silent for a long moment after they left. Then gradually the noise resumed, though many glances were cast Vaughn's way. Holloway approached, refilling Vaughn's glass without being asked. Been waiting for that showdown since the day he came back from back east, he commented. Boy's been nothing but trouble. Thinks his daddy's money makes him untouchable. Everyone's touchable, Vaughn replied, taking a long drink. That they are. Holloway hesitated, then added, Miss Edwards is special, Sutton. Not like most folks who drift through here. She's got a kindness to her that's genuine. Vaughn nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Crenshaw won't let this go, Holloway warned. His type never does. Wounded pride's more dangerous than a wounded rattler. I'll handle it, Vaughn said, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would. Not because Beatrice was his she wasn't, couldn't be, but because the world was a darker place without her smile in it, and he would not let Crenshaw extinguish that light. The next morning, Vaughn went to the sheriff's office, finding Miller at his desk doing paperwork. Sutton, the sheriff greeted him, looking surprised. Don't usually see you unless you're collecting a bounty. Need to talk about Crenshaw, Vaughn said without preamble. Miller sighed, putting down his pen. Heard about last night. Boy's a menace. But his father isn't the issue, Vaughn interrupted. Crenshaw's been threatening Beatrice Edwards. Following her, the sheriff's expression grew serious. That's so? She file a complaint. Would it matter if she did? Vaughn asked pointedly. Miller had the grace to look uncomfortable. You know how it is, Sutton. Old man Crenshaw practically owns the county commissioner. His son gets away with things other men would hang for. Not this time, Vaughn said, his voice hard. I'm telling you now, Sheriff. If Crenshaw comes near her again, I'll deal with him. And I won't be as gentle as I was last night. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. Never thought I'd see the day, he finally said. Vaughn Sutton, ready to kill for a woman. Not for a woman, Vaughn corrected. For justice. Crenshaw's had it coming for years. Everyone knows it. Maybe so. Miller leaned back in his chair. But we both know this isn't about justice, Sutton. It's about her. The question is, does she know how you feel? Vaughn didn't answer, his jaw tightening. The sheriff shook his head. Thought as much. Look, I'll have a word with Crenshaw. Tell him to keep his distance. But if you're serious about Miss Edwards, you might want to let her know before someone else tells her. This is a small town with big mouths. Vaughn nodded curtly and turned to leave. Sutton, the sheriff called after him. For what it's worth, she could do a lot worse. And I suspect you could do a lot better than the life you've been living these past few years. Outside, the morning sun was already hot, the streets of Llano beginning to fill with the day's activity. Vaughn headed toward the broken spoke, knowing Beatrice would be there working on the saloon's books. He found her at a corner table, ledgers spread before her, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She looked up as he approached, that smile appearing immediately. Something in his chest tightened at the sight. Vaughn, she greeted him. I didn't expect to see you this early. He sat across from her, removing his hat. "We need to talk. About Crenshaw." Her smile faltered. "What about him?" "Had a run-in with him last night. He's been following you, watching you." Vaughn's expression was grim. "He made threats." Beatrice sighed, closing the ledger before her. "I know. Mrs. Kavanaugh told me she's seen him lurking around the boarding house. And one of the girls at the general store warned me he's been asking questions about my schedule." Anger flared in Vaughn's chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew how you'd react," she replied calmly. "And I don't want you killing a man because he can't take no for an answer." "Wouldn't be the first man I've killed for less reason," Vaughn pointed out. "That's exactly my point." She leaned forward, her blue eyes intent on his. "You're more than your gun, Vaughn. More than the reputation you've built. I don't want you adding another name to your list because of me." He wanted to argue, to tell her that Crenshaw deserved whatever came to him, but the earnestness in her expression stopped him. "What do you suggest, then?" "I can handle Tucker Crenshaw," she said with quiet confidence. "He's a bully, and bullies fold when stood up to properly." "Unless they don't," Vaughn countered. "Men like Crenshaw, with money and connections, they're used to taking what they want." "Then I'll be ready." She smiled slightly. "I may look soft, Vaughn Sutton, but I grew up with 4 brothers and a farm to defend. I know how to take care of myself." He believed her, which was strange in itself. He couldn't remember the last time he'd taken someone at their word. "Still," he said, "I'd feel better if you'd let me help." Her expression softened. "I'm not saying I don't appreciate your concern. I do, more than you know. But I can't have you fighting my battles for me. It's not who I am." Vaughn nodded slowly, understanding even as he chafed against it. Beatrice Edwards wasn't a damsel in need of rescuing. She was a woman who had faced loss and hardship and emerged stronger for it. It was one of the things he admired most about her. "At least let me walk you places," he said finally. "Crenshaw's less likely to try something if you're not alone." She considered this, then nodded. "All right. But no threatening him, no provoking him, and absolutely no shooting him. Unless he draws first," Vaughn added, and the look she gave him was exasperated but tinged with something like fondness. "Vaughn Sutton, you are the most stubborn man I have ever met." The corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Part of my charm." She laughed then, a clear, bright sound that seemed to light up the dim saloon. "Is that what you call it? Charm?" And for the first time in 4 years, Vaughn felt himself smile a real smile, not the cold, calculating expression he sometimes used to unnerve opponents, but a genuine lifting of his lips that reached his eyes. It felt strange, like using a muscle long atrophied. Beatrice's laughter faded as she stared at him, her eyes widening slightly. "Well," she said softly, "would you look at that? The infamous bounty hunter can smile after all." Vaughn looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "Don't get used to it." "Oh, I think I might," she replied, and there was something in her voice, a warmth, a promise that made him look back at her. Their eyes met across the table, and in that moment, something shifted between them, some invisible barrier crumbling away. The sound of the saloon doors swinging open broke the moment. Holloway entered, nodding to them both before heading behind the bar to begin preparations for the day. "I should get back to work," Beatrice said, though she made no move to reopen the ledger. Vaughn nodded, rising from his seat and placing his hat back on his head. "I'll come by the boarding house this evening. Walk you to dinner." "I'd like that," she replied, that smile appearing again, the one that had first caught his attention, the one that seemed to promise that perhaps the world wasn't as dark and treacherous as he'd come to believe. As he stepped out into the sunlight, Vaughn realized with a jolt of surprise that for the first time since Isabel's betrayal, he was looking forward to something beyond his next bounty. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. For the next week, Vaughn fell into a pattern he had never imagined for himself. He walked Beatrice to and from the saloon each day, joined her for dinner most evenings, and found himself sharing more of his past than he had with anyone in years. She, in turn, told him about her dreams for the future, the small shop she hoped to open one day, selling books and stationery, the little house she wanted to have with a garden in the back. Crenshaw kept his distance, though Vaughn often felt eyes on them as they walked through town. The sheriff had apparently made good on his promise to speak to the young troublemaker, but Vaughn remained vigilant. Men like Crenshaw didn't give up easily, especially when their pride was wounded. On Sunday, Beatrice convinced Vaughn to accompany her to church, something he hadn't done regularly since childhood. He sat stiffly beside her in the pew, uncomfortably aware of the curious and sometimes disapproving glances from the townspeople. The bounty hunter and the bookkeeper made an odd pair in the eyes of Llano society. "Ignore them," Beatrice whispered, seeming to sense his discomfort. "Most of them have secrets far worse than anything they imagine about us." "It's not me I'm worried about," Vaughn replied quietly. "My reputation was shot long before I came to Llano. But yours is my own to worry about." She finished for him, her voice firm. "Besides, I'd rather be judged for the company I choose than praised for the company that's expected." After the service, they walked to the small cemetery on the edge of town. Beatrice had brought wildflowers, which she placed on several unmarked graves. "For those who have no one left to remember them," she explained when Vaughn asked. "Everyone deserves to be remembered." As they walked back toward town, taking the longer path along the creek, Vaughn found himself thinking about the graves he'd left behind, the men he'd killed, some deserving, some perhaps less so. He wondered who remembered them, who placed flowers on their final resting places. "What are you thinking about?" Beatrice asked, breaking into his thoughts. "You look troubled." Vaughn hesitated, then decided on honesty. "About the men I've killed." "How many of them have graves with flowers?" She was quiet for a moment, considering this. "The fact that you think about it at all says something, Vaughn. Most men in your position wouldn't give it a second thought." "Doesn't change what I've done." "No," she agreed. "But it might change what you do next." He glanced at her, struck again by her insight. "And what do you think I should do next?" She smiled, not answering directly. "What did you want to be before? When you had the ranch with your father?" The question caught him off guard. "Just a rancher, I suppose. Build up the herd. Maybe buy more land eventually." "Is that still possible?" He shook his head. "That life's gone." "The exact life?" "Yes," she acknowledged. "But the dream of it, having land, raising cattle, building something that lasts, that could still be possible." The thought had never occurred to Vaughn. After losing everything, he'd focused solely on survival, then on the grim satisfaction of bringing criminals to justice. The idea of starting over, of building something new, seemed foreign and dangerous, a hope he wasn't sure he could afford. "Maybe," he said noncommittally. They had reached a bend in the creek where a large cottonwood provided shade. Beatrice stopped, turning to face him. "Vaughn, may I ask you something personal?" He nodded, wary but willing. "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" The question hit closer to home than he wanted to admit. Before Beatrice had entered his life, he'd convinced himself that solitude was a choice, a protective measure. Now, having experienced the warmth of her company, the way her smile could brighten even his darkest moods, he was beginning to recognize it for what it truly was, a prison of his own making, just as she'd said. "Yes," he admitted, the word feeling like it was pulled from somewhere deep inside him. She stepped closer, her blue eyes searching his face. "So do I." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Vaughn found himself acutely aware of her proximity, of the scent of lavender that always surrounded her, of the way the dappled sunlight through the leaves cast patterns across her honey-blonde hair. "Beatrice," he began, not sure what he was going to say, but feeling the need to say something. The sound of approaching horses interrupted him. They both turned to see 3 riders coming along the creek path, Tucker Crenshaw and his 2 constant companions, all clearly drunk despite the early hour and the day of the week. Crenshaw reined in his horse when he spotted them, a slow, malicious smile spreading across his face. "Well, look what we have here, boys. The killer and his whore, out for a Sunday stroll." Vaughn stepped in front of Beatrice, his hand moving to his revolver. "Ride on, Crenshaw." "Or what?" Crenshaw dismounted, swaying slightly as his boots hit the ground. His companions remained on horseback, looking nervous. "You gonna shoot me, Sutton? In cold blood? On the Lord's day?" He laughed, the sound ugly and slurred. "Even you ain't that cold, Vaughn," Beatrice said quietly from behind him. "Remember what we discussed." Crenshaw's bloodshot eyes fixed on her. "There she is, the high and mighty Miss Edwards, who thinks she's too good for the likes of me, but spreads her legs for a killer." He took a step forward. "What does he have that I don't, honey? Is it the notches on his gun? The blood on his hands?" "Dignity," Beatrice replied coolly, stepping around Vaughn to face Crenshaw directly. "Self-respect. Basic human decency. Shall I go on?" Crenshaw's face darkened with rage. You little, that's enough, Vaughn cut in, his voice deadly quiet. Last chance, Crenshaw. Ride on, or I'll send you home to your daddy in pieces. For a tense moment, it seemed Crenshaw might actually be drunk enough to try something. Then one of his companions spoke up. Tucker, let's go. This ain't worth it. Crenshaw glared at them both, hatred plain in his eyes. This ain't over, he spat. Not by a long shot. He stumbled back to his horse, mounting clumsily. You watch your back, Sutton, and keep an eye on your woman. Be a shame if something happened to her while you were out hunting bounties. As the three rode away, Vaughn turned to Beatrice, his expression grim. This is escalating. He's going to try something. She nodded, her earlier composure giving way to a slight tremor in her hands. I know. I could end it, Vaughn said quietly. One bullet. No one would question it after the threats he's made. No, she said firmly, placing a hand on his arm. That's not the answer. We're not stooping to his level. Then what do you suggest? The sheriff won't do anything substantial. Crenshaw's father has too much influence. Beatrice was quiet for a moment, thinking. What if we left? She finally asked, looking up at him with those clear blue eyes. Left Llano, I mean. Started somewhere new. We. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Yes, we. Her voice was steady now, her gaze direct. Unless I've misunderstood what's been happening between us these past weeks. Vaughn felt something shift inside him, the last remnants of the walls he'd built around his heart, crumbling away. You haven't misunderstood, he said quietly. Her smile bloomed, genuine and hopeful. Then why not? You've said yourself there's nothing holding you to Llano. And I. She hesitated. I've discovered that what I want most isn't a shop or a garden, but a life with someone who sees me for who I am, who understands loss but chooses hope anyway. Vaughn looked at this woman before him, this remarkable woman who had somehow found her way past his defenses, who had shown him a kindness and understanding he'd thought no longer existed in the world, and felt a certainty he hadn't experienced in years. Where would we go? He asked, and the question was as good as a yes. Her smile widened. I've heard good things about Colorado territory. The land is beautiful, they say, and there are growing towns where a bookshop might do well. And ranching land is still affordable for those willing to work hard. The image arose unbidden in Vaughn's mind, a small ranch in the shadow of mountains, cattle grazing on green pastures, Beatrice beside him on the porch of a sturdy house, her smile as bright as the day he'd first seen it. It was a vision of a future he'd stopped believing was possible. Colorado, then, he agreed, and was rewarded with a joy in her expression that made his heart twist in his chest. Before he could say more, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a brief, sweet kiss that nonetheless sent a jolt through him like lightning. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed, but her eyes were steady on his. I've wanted to do that for weeks, she admitted. Vaughn raised a hand to cup her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the curve of her smile. Why didn't you? I was waiting for you to be ready, she replied simply. For you to believe that not every smile hides a knife. In answer, Vaughn lowered his head and kissed her properly, a kiss that contained 4 years of loneliness, weeks of growing hope, and the promise of a future he was finally allowing himself to imagine. Her arms came around his neck as she returned the kiss with equal fervor, and for the first time since Abilene, Vaughn felt something like peace settle over him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, he rested his forehead against hers. We'll leave at the end of the week, he said. Gives us time to settle our affairs and gather supplies for the journey. She nodded, her eyes shining with a happiness that made his chest ache. I don't have much to pack, just my books and clothes. We'll need a wagon, he said, already planning. Ghost can pull it. We'll take the northern route. Should be safer this time of year. Vaughn, she said, pulling back slightly to look into his eyes. Are you sure? About this? About us? He knew what she was really asking. Was he sure he could trust her? Trust this chance at happiness? Trust that her smile wasn't hiding something that would destroy him all over again? Yes, he said, and was surprised to find it was the absolute truth. I'm sure. The week that followed was filled with preparations. Vaughn purchased a sturdy wagon and supplies for the journey to Colorado, while Beatrice gave notice at the saloon and began packing her few possessions. They agreed to keep their plans quiet, not wanting word to reach Crenshaw before they were ready to depart. But in a town as small as Llano, secrets were hard to keep. By Wednesday, rumors were circulating that the bounty hunter and the bookkeeper were planning to leave town together. By Thursday, those rumors had reached Tucker Crenshaw. Vaughn was at the livery, discussing the journey with Mr. Perkins and ensuring Ghost was ready for the long haul, when Sheriff Miller appeared in the doorway. "Need a word, Sutton," he said, his expression grave. They stepped outside, where the sheriff didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Crenshaw's been drinking heavily since Sunday. Been making threats about you and Miss Edwards. Serious ones." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "How serious?" "Serious enough that his own men are worried. One of them came to me this morning, said Tucker's got it in his head to make an example of you both before you can leave town." "When?" "Tonight, most likely. He knows you're planning to leave soon." The sheriff ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, Sutton, I can't officially intervene without evidence of a crime. Old man Crenshaw would have my badge. But I thought you should know." Vaughn nodded, his mind already racing. "Where's Beatrice now?" "Saw her at the general store about an hour ago, picking up supplies." The sheriff hesitated. "I could hold you both at the jail tonight. For your own protection. Unofficial like. Appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but we'll handle it our own way." Vaughn started toward the general store, then paused. "But if you happen to be busy on the other side of town tonight around sundown, I wouldn't complain." Miller gave him a knowing look. "Might be some disturbance at the Wilkersons' place out by the creek. Might take me and my deputy most of the evening to sort out." "Much obliged," Vaughn said, and headed into town at a brisk pace. He found Beatrice emerging from the general store, her arms full of packages. Her face lit up when she saw him, but quickly turned concerned as she registered his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked as he took the packages from her. "Crenshaw knows we're leaving. Sheriff says he's planning something for tonight." Vaughn's voice was low, his eyes scanning the street as they walked. "Change of plans. We leave today, as soon as possible." Beatrice nodded, no trace of fear in her expression, just determination. "I'm nearly packed. Just need to collect my things from the boarding house." "I'll come with you," Vaughn said. "Then we'll head straight out. We can make it to the Wilson Creek crossing by nightfall, camp there. Be well out of Crenshaw's reach by morning." They moved quickly through the streets of Llano, both aware of the curious and sometimes hostile glances from townspeople. News traveled fast, and not everyone was pleased to see the notorious bounty hunter absconding with one of the town's more respectable women. At the boarding house, Mrs. Kavanaugh met them at the door, her expression troubled. "Miss Edwards, there was a man here looking for you earlier. One of the Crenshaw hands. He wouldn't say what he wanted." "Did he leave?" Vaughn asked sharply. "Yes, about an hour ago. But he was asking questions about your schedule, when you usually return, that sort of thing." The widow wrung her hands. "I didn't like the look of him." "We're leaving town today," Beatrice told her, already moving toward the stairs. "I'll just get my things." "I'll help," Mrs. Kavanaugh said, following her up. "You don't have time to waste." While the women packed, Vaughn kept watch from the porch, his hand never far from his revolver. The street was quiet, most people indoors during the hottest part of the day, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. 20 minutes later, Beatrice emerged with 2 carpet bags and a small trunk, Mrs. Kavanaugh behind her with a basket of food for their journey. "It's not much," the widow said, pressing the basket into Beatrice's hands. "But it'll see you through a day or two." "Thank you for everything," Beatrice said, embracing the older woman. "I'll write when we're settled." "See that you do." Mrs. Kavanaugh turned to Vaughn, her expression stern. "And you, Mr. Sutton, you take care of her, you hear? She's a special one." "Yes, madam," Vaughn replied, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. They headed directly to the livery, where the wagon was already prepared. Vaughn loaded Beatrice's belongings while Perkins hitched Ghost to the wagon. The dappled gray stallion seemed to sense the urgency, standing patiently in the traces without his usual restlessness. Road should be clear all the way to Wilson Creek, Perkins told them as Vaughn helped Beatrice onto the wagon seat. "But watch yourself at the crossing. Water's been high with the spring melt." "We will," Vaughn assured him, climbing up beside Beatrice and taking the reins. "Much obliged for your help." As they pulled out of the livery, Vaughn kept a wary eye on their surroundings, half expecting to see Crenshaw and his men waiting for them. But the streets remained quiet as they passed through town, heading north toward the road that would eventually take them to Colorado and their new life together. It wasn't until they were at the edge of town that Vaughn spotted riders in the distance, coming fast from the direction of the Crenshaw ranch. He urged Ghost to a faster pace, the wagon bouncing over the rutted road. "Is it them?" Beatrice asked, her hand gripping his arm. "Yes." Vaughn reached beneath the seat, pulling out his rifle and handing it to her. "You know how to use this?" "My father taught me," she replied, taking the weapon with steady hands. "But Vaughn, I won't shoot to kill." "Pray it doesn't come to that," he said grimly, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "We've got a head start. If we can make it to the tree line, we'll have better cover." The riders were gaining, 5 of them now visible, Crenshaw's distinctive chestnut stallion in the lead. They were still out of rifle range, but that wouldn't last long at the pace they were setting. Vaughn pushed Ghost harder, the stallion responding with a burst of speed that had the wagon wheels leaving the ground over larger bumps. Beatrice held tight to the seat with one hand, the rifle ready in the other. "Almost there," Vaughn said as the tree line loomed closer. "Once we're in the woods, the wagon will slow them down. They'll have to come at us single file on the trail." They had just reached the first trees when the crack of a rifle shot split the air, the bullet splintering wood from the back of the wagon. "They're shooting already," Beatrice said, her voice remarkably calm. "Vaughn, they really mean to kill us. Or scare us into stopping," he replied, guiding the wagon onto the narrower forest trail. "Either way, they're not taking us back to Llano." The dense pine forest swallowed them, the trail winding between massive trunks. The riders would have to slow significantly to follow, giving Vaughn and Beatrice precious time. But they were still hours from Wilson Creek, and the wagon couldn't maintain this pace on the rough trail for long. "There's a clearing ahead with an old trapper's cabin," Vaughn said, remembering the layout of the land from previous hunts. "Abandoned years ago, but the walls are solid. We can make a stand there if needed." Beatrice nodded, her expression resolute. "I trust you, Vaughn." Those simple words, spoken with such conviction, struck him deeply. She trusted him with her life, with her future, and for the first time in 4 long years, he found himself truly trusting in return not just in her, but in the possibility of the life they were fighting for. The clearing appeared ahead, the small log cabin standing amidst tall grass and wildflowers. Vaughn guided the wagon directly to the cabin door, jumping down and helping Beatrice descend. "Get inside," he instructed, grabbing his saddlebags and extra ammunition. "I'll unhitch Ghost and bring him around back." She nodded, taking the rifle and her small valise and hurrying into the cabin. Vaughn worked quickly to free Ghost from the traces, leading the stallion to a small lean to behind the cabin where he wouldn't be visible from the trail. Inside, Beatrice had already assessed their situation. The cabin was a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow bed frame with a rotted mattress. There were 2 windows, one facing the clearing, one the back, and a single door. "Not ideal," she commented as Vaughn entered, "but defensible." He looked at her with newfound appreciation. Most women would be panicking, but Beatrice was clear-eyed and focused, already moving the table to provide better cover near the front window. "They'll be here soon," Vaughn said, checking his revolver before positioning himself at the window. "Stay low and away from the openings. With luck, they'll think twice about attacking once they see we're ready for them." "And if luck isn't with us?" she asked, joining him at the window with the rifle. "Then we show them why it was a mistake to follow us," he replied grimly. They didn't have to wait long. Within 20 minutes, the sound of horses approaching reached them. Crenshaw and his men emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing, reining in when they spotted the abandoned wagon. "Sutton," Crenshaw's voice carried across the open space. "I know you're in there. Come out and face me like a man." Vaughn didn't respond, signaling Beatrice to remain silent as well. Let Crenshaw waste his breath shouting. "You stole what was mine, Sutton." Crenshaw continued, clearly drunk or half mad with rage. "The bookkeeper was meant for me. Everyone in town knows it." Beside him, Vaughn felt Beatrice stiffen. "I was never his," she whispered fiercely. "Never even gave him the time of day." "He knows," Vaughn replied quietly. "That's what's eating at him. You chose me over him, and his pride can't take it." Crenshaw was still shouting, working himself into a frenzy. I'm giving you one chance, Sutton. Send her out, and maybe I'll let you live. Otherwise, we're burning that cabin to the ground with both of you in it." One of Crenshaw's men spoke up, looking uncomfortable. "Tucker, this has gone too far. You're talking about murder now." "Shut up." Crenshaw rounded on the man. "You either stand with me or you're against me. And you know what happens to people who cross me." The man backed down, but Vaughn could see the unease spreading among Crenshaw's companions. They'd signed up for intimidation, maybe a beating, but not cold-blooded murder. "They're divided," he murmured to Beatrice. "That works in our favor." "What do we do?" she asked. Vaughn considered their options. They could try to wait it out. Crenshaw was drunk enough that he might eventually pass out or be convinced by his men to give up. But there was also the risk he'd follow through on his threat to burn them out. "I'm going to try to end this without bloodshed," Vaughn decided. "But be ready with the rifle. If things go bad, aim for the horses first. It'll create confusion and give us an advantage." Before she could protest, he called out, "Crenshaw, let's talk this through. No need for anyone to die today." "Too late for talk, Sutton," Crenshaw shouted back. "You had your chance. Think about what you're doing," Vaughn continued, keeping his voice level. "The sheriff knows you threatened us. If we turn up dead, you'll hang." This gave the other men pause, and Vaughn could see them exchanging worried glances. One of them leaned toward Crenshaw, speaking urgently in his ear. "Your men don't seem too eager to follow you to the gallows," Vaughn called. "Why not turn around, head back to town, and forget this happened? We'll be gone by morning, out of your hair for good." For a moment, it seemed like reason might prevail. Two of Crenshaw's men were already turning their horses, clearly wanting no part of what was to come. But then Crenshaw did the one thing Vaughn had been hoping to avoid. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey, took a long drink, and drew his revolver. "Last chance, Sutton," he slurred, waving the gun erratically. "Send her out or burn." "Get down," Vaughn told Beatrice, dropping below the windowsill just as Crenshaw fired, the bullet embedding itself in the cabin wall. "He's beyond reason," Beatrice said, her voice tight but controlled. "What now?" Vaughn checked his revolver one more time. "I'm going out there. End this once and for all." "No." She grabbed his arm, her eyes fierce. "That's exactly what he wants. He'll shoot you the moment you step through that door. Better me than both of us trapped in here if he decides to set fire to the place." Vaughn covered her hand with his own. "I've been in worse situations, Beatrice. Trust me." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "I do trust you, but I'm not staying in here while you face them alone." She raised the rifle. "I'll cover you from the window." Vaughn wanted to argue, to insist she stay safe, but the determination in her eyes told him it would be futile. And the truth was, having her cover him improved his odds considerably. "All right," he agreed. "But if it goes badly, if I'm hit, you run out the back. Ghost is ready to ride. You get on him and don't stop until you reach the next town." "It won't come to that," she said with a confidence that almost made him believe it. Vaughn moved to the door, taking a deep breath before calling out one last time. "Crenshaw, I'm coming out. Just me. Let's settle this man to man." "About time, you coward," Crenshaw shouted back. "Be careful," Beatrice whispered, moving into position at the window. Vaughn nodded, then stepped through the door into the fading evening light, his hands visible but ready to draw at a moment's notice. Crenshaw sat astride his horse 20 yards away, his revolver aimed directly at Vaughn. His remaining men had backed their horses up, clearly wanting distance from whatever was about to happen. "Here I am," Vaughn said, walking slowly into the clearing. "Now let's be reasonable about this, Crenshaw. You've made your point. Your quarrel's with me, not the woman. Let her go on her way, and you and I can settle our differences." Crenshaw laughed, an ugly, slurred sound. "Always the hero, ain't you, Sutton? The stone-cold killer with a heart of gold." He spat on the ground. "I see through you. You're just a man who couldn't protect what was his once, so now you're overcompensating." The words hit uncomfortably close to home, but Vaughn kept his expression neutral. "Maybe so, but I'm still the man she chose. That's what really burns you, isn't it? That she looked at you, with all your daddy's money and influence, and decided you weren't worth the time of day." Crenshaw's face contorted with rage. "Shut your mouth. She saw right through you," Vaughn continued, deliberately provoking him now, wanting him angry enough to make a mistake. "Saw the coward hiding behind daddy's name, the boy playing at being a man. With a roar of fury, Crenshaw fired, the shot going wide as his horse shifted nervously beneath him. Before he could fire again, Vaughn had drawn and fired twice in rapid succession. The first bullet struck Crenshaw's shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. The second hit the pommel of his saddle, sending splinters flying. Crenshaw's horse reared in panic, throwing its wounded rider to the ground. The revolver flew from his grasp, landing several feet away. Vaughn approached cautiously, his gun still trained on Crenshaw, who lay groaning, clutching his shoulder. "It's over," Vaughn said, kicking Crenshaw's revolver further away. "You're done." Crenshaw looked up at him, hatred burning in his bloodshot eyes. "You think this changes anything? My father will destroy you for this. Both of you." "Your father can't reach us where we're going," Vaughn replied. He turned to the remaining men, who sat frozen on their horses. "Take him back to town. Get the doctor to look at that shoulder. And tell him if he ever comes after us again, the next bullet won't be so merciful." The men nodded, clearly relieved that the confrontation was ending without further bloodshed. They dismounted to help their fallen leader, who continued to curse and threaten as they lifted him onto his horse. Vaughn kept his revolver ready until the party had disappeared into the trees, heading back toward Llano. Only when they were out of sight did he allow himself to lower the gun, the tension draining from his body. "Vaughn!" Beatrice emerged from the cabin, the rifle in her hands. She ran to him, her eyes scanning him for injuries. "Are you all right? I was ready to shoot if he tried anything else." "I'm fine," he assured her, holstering his weapon and pulling her close. "It's over. They won't follow us now." She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. "For a moment there, I thought." "I know." He held her tighter, breathing in the scent of her hair. "But it's done. We can go on now." She pulled back to look up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears and something else of fierce joy that made his breath catch. "Yes, we can." They spent the night in the cabin, taking turns keeping watch though both doubted Crenshaw or his men would return. By dawn, they were back on the trail, the wagon repacked and Ghost rested for the journey ahead. As they crossed Wilson Creek that morning, the water glinting gold in the early light, Vaughn looked at Beatrice beside him on the wagon seat. Her face was turned up to the sun, that smile he'd first noticed in the saloon lighting her features. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. She turned to him, the smile deepening, revealing that dimple in her right cheek that he'd come to cherish. "Not a single one." Vaughn found himself smiling in return, a real smile that came easier now, that felt less like a forgotten skill and more like a natural expression of the hope that had taken root within him. "Me neither." And as they continued north, toward the mountains and the future they would build together, Vaughn Sutton realized that for the first time in 4 years, he was looking forward, not back. The past would always be there with its scars and lessons, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was the woman beside him with her genuine smile and steadfast heart, the woman who had taught him that not every smile hid a knife, that trust, while risky, was worth the reward. By the time they reached Colorado 2 weeks later, the story of the bounty hunter and the bookkeeper who had fled Llano was already fading into local legend back in Texas. Some said Crenshaw had died of his wound. Others claimed he'd been sent east by his father to avoid scandal. The truth, as is often the case, lay somewhere in between. Crenshaw recovered from his injury, but was a changed man, humbled by his defeat and the desertion of his companions when it mattered most. In a small town nestled at the foot of the Colorado mountains, Vaughn and Beatrice began their new life together. They were married by a local preacher within days of their arrival, a simple ceremony with borrowed rings and no guests, but with more genuine joy than many grander weddings. With the bounty money from Fletcher Davis and Beatrice's careful savings, they purchased a modest parcel of land with a small cabin and good grazing for cattle. While Vaughn set about building their herd, starting with just 10 head, Beatrice opened a tiny bookshop in the growing town, quickly becoming a beloved fixture in the community. Years passed, and the nightmares that had plagued Vaughn since Abilene gradually faded, replaced by peaceful sleep beside the woman whose smile had first broken through his defenses. Their family grew a son with Vaughn's gray eyes and Beatrice's indomitable spirit, followed 2 years later by twin daughters who kept them both on their toes with their curiosity and energy. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house they had built to replace the original cabin. Watching their children play in the yard with the latest addition to the family, a shaggy dog of indeterminate breeding, Beatrice turned to Vaughn with that same smile that had never lost its power to warm his heart. "Happy?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Vaughn took her hand, his thumb tracing over the simple gold band he'd placed there a decade before. "More than I ever thought possible," he replied, and kissed her as the Colorado sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors as bright and promising as the future they had built together, a future that began with a smile in a dusty saloon and the courage to trust it might be real.